Hello, I'm Isaac Shub. I work at the New Haven Free Public Library. And I work in the reference department and adult services. And on behalf of the library, I just want to welcome you to another talk in the Democracy in America series with Professor Matthew Jacobson of Yale and tonight's guest, Professor Khalil Johnson of Wesleyan. Their talk tonight is titled American Education and Domestic Imperialism. Before they get started, the New Haven Free Public Library is now open for limited in-person browsing. So if you didn't know that, you can actually come into the library to borrow books. I'd very much love to see you all there. But without further ado, from Public Humanities at Yale and the New Haven Free Public Library, I'm glad to welcome you to tonight's talk, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Isaac. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. I want to start off just by thanking our partners at the New Haven Free Public Library. This has been a really important partnership between the Public Humanities Program at Yale and the libraries here in New Haven, especially our partners Seth Godfrey, Marian Huggins, Luis Chavez Bramel, Rory Mordarana, and Isaac Shub, who you just met. This is the last event of this season. It's been a great season for us, and I hope for you as well. Amid tough times, we will be back in the fall. There are questions about what that will look like. I don't know what Yale's policy will be on these things, and I don't know what the library's policy will be on these things, and I don't know what COVID's policy will be on these things, but in some form or another, hopefully with some brick and mortar in-face meetings, the Democracy in American series will continue, so you can keep your eye out for the next year's schedule on both the Public Humanities and the New Haven Free Public Library websites. I also want to thank my colleague Karen Rothman in Public Humanities and our associate Swagato Chakraborty, who's working on the back end of the webinar right now. And also our student Alex Bornak, who's done a lot of work getting flyers out and with publicity work. We acknowledge the unjust history of the land we stand on tonight and the indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples who have occupied what is now Connecticut through thousands of years and stewarded its lands and waters. We pay respect to the region's indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Quinnipiac diaspora. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Khalil Johnson, Jr. Khalil took his PhD at Yale, and he currently teaches up the road in the African American Studies program at Wesleyan. He specializes in the intertwined histories of the African diaspora and indigenous peoples in North America, with emphases on US settler colonialism, education, and social movements for justice. While teaching elementary school on the Navajo Nation, he unwittingly joined a historic cohort of African Americans who taught in reservation boarding schools as employees of the Bureau of Indian Affairs during the Civil Rights era. In his current book project, Schooled: The Education of Black and Indigenous People in the United States and Abroad, 1730 to 1980, Johnson historicizes the post-war migration of hundreds of African-American educators to Indian country. He has unearthed a colonial genealogy of 4 generations of social reformers, missionaries, philanthropists, activists, and teachers who since the 18th century have used schooling to reconcile the founding cataclysms of the United States, the ongoing presence of indigenous nations, free Black people, and non-white immigrants. The result is a dramatic and transnational reinterpretation of American education and its consequences for colonized peoples across the globe. Dr. Johnson's essays and editorials have appeared in American Quarterly, Pacific Historical Review, and the Navajo Times. In 2015, he received recognition from the Western History Association for the year's best essay on Native American history. His teaching areas include courses in the history of emancipatory education and US empire, early African-American history, American Indian history, and popular music, which actually we will get a bit of a sense of tonight. It is my great pleasure to welcome Khalil Johnson.
Thank you, Matt, for inviting me to the conversation today, and thanks to the staff at the New Haven Free Public Library for organizing and hosting this event. I feel like I'm part of history right now, and it's very special to be here with you from my home office in Worcester Square. So I'm gonna go ahead and start by sharing my screen because I have a little slideshow. Let's hope this all works. So my talk today is about the history of education and what I'm calling domestic imperialism, which maybe makes sense for some people and maybe doesn't for others. It's another way of saying that my talk today is also about the blues. Just to add some signposts as you follow along, we'll be discussing 3 shades of the blues: the Yale blues, the barbarian blues, and the darker than blues. So let's begin this evening just by moving back in time some 286 years ago, when New Haven was still a minor colonial town in the vast British Empire, and Yale College encompassed a single 3-story wooden building on the corner of College and Chapel Streets in New Haven, Connecticut. In December 1734, 2 young Mohican boys from the Mohican Nation arrived in New Haven, accompanied by an Englishman named John Sargent. The boys were named Nungaquat, who was about 9 years old, and Itowaquam, who was about 8. Their parents were political leaders who, with the consent of the Mohican community, had recently decided to allow the Massachusetts government to establish a Christian mission and an English school among them. John Sargent was going to be their missionary, but he was also currently teaching at Yale, so Nungaquat and Itowaquam volunteered to join him in New Haven that winter so they could teach him the Mohican language and begin learning English and literacy. So Sargent writes in his journal on December 14th, we got to New Haven. I took the boys into my college chamber and sent them to the free school kept at New Haven. They lived very contentedly and were made much of by everybody. For indeed, they were a couple of very likely boys. That's a nice thing to say of him. There it is there, sorry. So there's no record of what these boys thought of John Sargent or the free school on the Green. So we have to kind of use our imagination. And I would say that the architecture of the school would not have been wholly unfamiliar to these young Mohicans. So except for the pitched roof, the college itself resembles the longhouses that the boys would have seen when visiting their uncles in the Mohawk Nation, since it was roughly the same height and dimensions. But this building, unlike the longhouse, was painted blue. And when I imagine the experience of these young Mohicans, it must have been a strange and marvelous thing to have been voluntarily go among a people who could make their buildings the same color blue as the sky. This blue building was special because it's where the English in this colony trained their ministers, their teachers, and their statesmen. Sargent himself had graduated from there in 1729. In fact, he was even the class Victorian at Yale. But the 24-year-old Englishman, which by the way is how old I was when I was teaching on the Navajo Nation, John Sargent was not a very good student from the Mohican perspective. The Mohican Nation was every bit as cosmopolitan as the English colonists. In 1710, when John Sargent was still a little newborn baby, Itowaquam's maternal grandfather and namesake had traveled to England and in fact saw a performance of Shakespeare's Macbeth at the Queen Theater. And long before the English established its colony in New Haven in 1638, the land itself had been known to Mohicans through their relations in the on the flip side, during John Sargent's visits to their villages on the Housatonic River, my internet connection is unstable. Okay. Mohican leaders had attempted to introduce him to their basic political and moral philosophies, their economic practices, their learned scientists. They showed him that the colonies of Massachusetts and Connecticut were newcomers into an ancient political landscape with many nations and overlapping sovereignties that was grounded and sustained through kinship relations. They showed him how they governed through consensus and consent, and that they involved all members of the community in decision-making, including women and children. They showed him an egalitarian economic system based on the redistribution of property and general reciprocity. And they demonstrated their learned knowledge in astronomy, medicine, ritual divination, and ecology. Yet all of these instructions appeared absolutely illegible to John Sargent. Observing one ceremony, he wrote, "They dance round a hot fire till they're almost ready to faint and are wet with sweat, and then run out, stripping themselves naked, expose their bodies to the cold air, and if there be snow upon the ground, roll in it until they are cold, and then return to their dancing again. And when they are hot and tired, cool themselves in the same manner." When Sargent witnessed these practices, he began to worry that he was exposing himself to, quote, "many fatigues and hardships, and I know not what dangers among a barbarous people." Now, when Nungaquat and Atalaquam's fathers arrived in New Haven in May of 1735 to retrieve their children, Sargent reported that, quote, "the lads had learned to read and write English very well for the time." And he said that, "I entertained these men with as much respect and kindness as I could, showed them our library and the rarities of the college." I would just say that perhaps if John Sargent had spent more time in the library, he would have had advance in his learning as much as these Mohican boys did under his care. For the Mohican way of life was not entirely alien to the British. Indeed, Sargent could read in Julius Caesar's commentaries in the Yale Library that when Caesar first encountered the ancient Britons in 55 BCE, he observed that although they were, quote, "simple and barbarous, they have a great many governments among them, and their societies included a learned class known as the Druids." Likewise, in historian William Camden's book, Britannia, Sargent could learn that the Mohicans he observed, quote, Sargent would have learned that like the Mohicans he observed, quote, "Britain maintains many nations with their sovereigns, and that these indigenous Britons, quote, live in tents, naked and without shoes."
Hello, Professor Johnson.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just I'm realizing that I don't think we're able to see your presentation.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
I know.
Let me see what's going on. Oh, you're just seeing my screen? Does this work? Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm going to
give us a little,
we'll just, okay.
Sorry to wait so long.
No, it's all right. Here's an opening quote from Curtis Mayfield, 1970. "Pardon me, brother, as long as you stand your glory, I won't mind if I tell the whole story," because I'm trying to do that right now. This is Yale. This is a Iroquoian longhouse. Note the resemblance. Here is the New Haven Green with the Blue College. This is Atalaquam when he visited England in 1710. And now we're, I think, back up to speed. So Caesar, Camden's Britannia. Although I have a typo there, it says Britannis, my bad. Thanks for the heads up, Isaac. All right, where was I? Okay, these Britons, quote, "live in tents, naked and without shoes. They have their wives in common and maintain all their children. The people have the principal share in the government among them. They are accustomed to bear hunger, cold, and all kind of toil, for they will continue several days up to their chins in water and bear hunger many days." So hopefully you can note the resemblance between those passages from British antiquity and Sargent's experience among Mohican in his current era in the 1730s. But even if Sargent had equated himself with these historical accounts, it's unlikely that he would have identified with these ancient Britons. After all, Sargent was white, he was English, and perhaps most importantly, he considered himself to be civilized. The ancient Britons were barbaric, uncivilized, and in fact, they were blue. Roman chroniclers had observed that the indigenous inhabitants of the British Isles mark their bodies with various figures and all kinds of animals, which is the reason why they wear no clothes for fear of hiding these figures, and that they dyed their bodies with woad, which is a plant that produced a blue hue. By the 16th century, such depictions of these ancient inhabitants of Britain, especially the Picts who lived in what's now Scotland, had discursively collapsed into the same category as the indigenous savages, so-called savages, that European empires encountered through colonial expansions in Americas, Africa, and the Pacific. And when the British became conquerors themselves, they also began to identify with the Roman conquerors at the expense of their indigenous forebears in Britain. So here's an illustration right there that's included in a book of similar depictions of Native peoples in Virginia. And this says a true picture of one Pict. So this is a clearly depiction of a Scottish savage, and the ideas mutually began to reinforce each other. And so Tacitus, writing about his father-in-law, General Agricola, who expanded the Roman Empire through its conquest of Britain in the late 1st century of the Common Era, described the process by which the Romans attempt to civilize the islands. And I'll just show the quote. It says, "For in order that men who by their unsettled and uncivilized state were always ready for war might be accustomed to peace and inactivity by pleasure, the general," meaning General Agricola, "privately suggested and publicly concurred in erecting temples, marketplaces, houses, committing those who shared a readiness to these works, and censuring those who appeared remiss. Thus, honorable emulation produced the effect of obligation. He," meaning Agricola, "applied himself to instruct the sons of chiefs in the liberal arts, and appeared to prefer the genius of the Britons to the accomplishments of the Gauls, insomuch as they who but a little while before disdained the language, now affected the eloquence of Rome. This produced an esteem for our dress. The toga became into general use, and by degrees they adopted our vicious indulgences, porticos and baths and splendid tables." So I'm sure that many of you are already picking up on the parallels between General Agricola's endeavors and John Sargent's attempt to instruct the sons of Mohican chiefs in the liberal arts. And I want to say for a moment here, just to stay here to stress that Tacitus completes his commentary on the civilizing process by stating, quote, "This among these uniform or uninformed people was called cultivation, whereas in fact, it was only an appendage of slavery." So what does that mean? To me, it means that Tacitus is recognizing that the imposition of Roman civility upon the Britons can be seen as a form of subjection that accompanied conquest and was a means or an attempt to remake these many independent indigenous sovereignties into a politically homogenous vassals of the Roman Empire. So even as the historian William Camden referred to this process as the Roman yoke, this yoke, he would go on to say, this yoke of the Romans, however oppressive, was not without its advantages. The saving light of the gospel beamed in upon the Britons at the same time of which hereafter, and the light that illustrates empire dispelled barbarism from the Britons, as it had done the other nations whom it subdued. So, yet these so-called barbarian tribes in the North and Western Europe continued to resist imperial rule for hundreds of years, precipitating the empire's collapse in the 4th century. And as John Sargent could read in the Yale Library, a book called Pufendorf's History of Europe, quote, "England the Romans quitted because they were not able to defend it against the Scots. The Visigoths settled themselves in Spain, the Vandals in Africa, and Gaul was divided among the Goths, Burgundians, and France," and so on and so on. And so I just want to know that we show our imperial biases today whenever we colloquially refer to this period after the fall of Rome as the Dark Ages, right? Like dark to whom? Dark maybe because we don't have the same records, it's less legible, but for other people, it was a new Renaissance freedom, the expulsation of slavery and vassalage. So 600 years would stand between the last great ancient academy at Alexandria and the first European universities in Paris and Bologna. But the liberal arts survived through the Roman Catholic Church and in pockets of Southern Europe where Roman law still prevailed. So gradually, as classical education reemerged within Southern Britain, so too did these ancient notions of civilization, barbarism, and empire. As our contemporary historian, Silke Stroh, has argued, the Roman Empire provided a model for British identity constructions as the center of civilization and a colonizing world power. Likewise, historian David Armitage adds that the very language of British imperial ideology of, quote, Great Britain, empire, and colony was not forged originally in Ireland, the Caribbean, or the Americas, but it sprang instead from the Anglo-Scottish relations in the late 1540s. Lowland Scots, like their English neighbors, spoke the same language. They lived in settled communities. They worshipped and practiced the same basic political economies and Protestant religion. And they saw these Gaelic-speaking pastoralist Scottish clans in the Highlands as wild savages that hadn't really evolved much beyond the ancient Picts. We have here Mel Gibson demonstrating a current view of the Highlanders as savages with the blue paint, of course. Yet the Scottish clans in the Highlands met another force in King James. During the late 16th century, the Scottish King James initiated a campaign to civilize the Highlands by planting colonies of lowland Scots among them. And after James became King of England and Ireland in 1603, he initiated a new policy to unify Britain that required the Highland clan chiefs to deliver their children to the lowlanders, where they would be taken and civilized in English-speaking Protestant schools. So James has thus followed the playbook first established in Britain by General Agricola 1,400 years earlier in order to force these Highland clans under the British yoke. But unlike William Camden, contemporary historians are less likely to view this as the triumph of civilization over barbarity. As Stroh writes, the Highlanders' real offense was not a lack of rules and authority, but that it posited an alternative system of rules and authority, one which the rest of the nation was trying to transcend, but which still held out on the periphery due to the latter's relative autonomy from the centralist state authority. Of course, the same might be said for John Sargent's endeavors among the Mohican Nation. Indeed, his mission received financial support from lowland Scots, who were seeking to export their own work among the Highlanders to the indigenous peoples of North America, specifically New England. And because experience had confirmed what Cotton Mather asserted, that Indians were, quote, shiftless, familiar language if you've ever read The Souls of Black Folks, he wrote in a personal, he meaning Sargent, wrote in an appeal in 1743 from funding from the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, that he had devised a new method for the education of Indian children. And he says, quote, "It shall in the most effectual manner change their whole habit of thinking and acting and raise them as far as possible into the condition of civil, industrious, and polished people." What Sargent was proposing was a boarding school where Indian children held under constant supervision would spend half a day in manual labor and the other half in study, quote, "so as little time as possible may be lost in idleness." So this method contains the germs of things to come, but it's going to lay dormant for another generation. In fact, it will need to wait until after the American Revolution to bear fruit. After the Revolution, it becomes a model for US civilizing missions in Hawaii. And after that, or rather after the wars against American Indians in the West, it becomes the model for industrial boarding schools for Native Americans. And after the Civil War, at places like Hampton Institute or Tuskegee University, it becomes the model for the education of African Americans. And after the Spanish-American War, it becomes a model for Puerto Ricans and Filipinos. And the fact that these schooling practices tended to follow imperial wars rather than suggests that rather than a pathway to emancipation, but schooling might better be seen as the continuation of martial violence by other means. So at this point, you're probably wondering what any of this has to do with domestic imperialism. To which I would respond that most Americans are taught in school that our nation revolted against a tyrannical British Empire, and that colonialism ended, if it ever existed, with maybe the founding of the Republic, or perhaps in 1869 with the Golden Spike and the Transnational Railroad, or Transcontinental Railroad. But from the perspective of indigenous peoples, as well as many Africans in the 13 colonies, and certainly from the perspective of the people who would come to live under US imperialism in the territories, the revolution simply transferred imperial domination from the British to the United States. And even as the United States established a new constitution and gradually developed its own distinct institutions, self-identity, culture, the clearest evidence of continuity from British Empire to the American Empire can be gleaned from the fact that Yale is one of 9 liberal arts colleges established before the revolution that continues today. And these institutional continuities across time also suggest a continuity of purpose. When English settlers established these colleges and universities, Harvard in 1636, William and Mary, 1693, Yale, 1701, they intended to replicate the classical liberal arts training and hierarchies of the old world, and their graduates would constitute a Protestant elite who ministered and governed these colonies. So this classical and theological schooling divided, as I've tried to show earlier, the world between savage and civilized. The civilized world is masculine, it's settled, it's fixed, it's straight, it's legible. Its denizens are economically productive, they're taxable, they're Christian. The savages were feminine, mobile, shiftless, heathen. Their culture's barbarous and their social organization absolutely illegible. And not only were these idle vagrants and wanderers uninterested in laboring beyond mere subsistence, but they also favored communal property regimes that were resistant to state extraction. And they occasionally raided or stole shit from the fixed settlements for its resources. And they often exacted tributes from the state through warfare. So since this savagery described a subjective theory of human difference rather than a kind of coherent social practice, the theory would thus serve as a lasting shifting signifier. And it was always racially calibrated, whether you move from white to blue to brown to black. And as the expansionist state encountered new populations beyond the Pale, they could be English, they could be wild Irish, they could be American Indian, African. They all threatened civilized imperial society and they required correction. So in other words, from General Agricola to King James to John Sargent to our contemporary compulsory primary schools and elite universities, the purpose of schooling has been to enclose alternative systems of rules and authority and replace them with modes of thought and action consistent with subjection under empire. And if you're like me, I suppose you are because you're here at this webinar, you probably happen to love school and maybe even like it today. And it can be a depressing realization to think that you've been taught to become an imperial subject and that maybe you've been purposefully robbed of other ways of thinking, living, being, and loving in this world through the process of compulsory education. So I told y'all this was about the blues. It's depressing. But these alternative systems endure despite and beyond empire. Just as Mohican nations continue to endure, and like the Mohicans are still here. They just had to move away from the English to Wisconsin, where unfortunately the United States still swallowed them up. But the blues itself also teaches us alternative possibilities. So with what Paul Gilroy has called shamanic authority, I want to turn to Curtis Mayfield, who composed a subterranean declaration of independence for these so-called savages and barbarians that embraces alternative modes and loves whatever the empire deems to be savage within these people. The song is called "We the People Who Are Darker Than Blue," and I invite you to listen with me for a few minutes before we begin the discussion. I hope the audio works.
we're gonna stand around this town and let what others say come true. We're just good for nothing, they all figure. A boyish grown-up shiftless jigger. Now we can't hardly stand for that. Or is that really where it's at? We people who are darker than blue, this ain't no time for segregating. I'm talking about brown and yellow too. High yellow girl, can you tell? You're just the surface of our dark, deep well. If your mind could really see, you know your color is same as me. Pardon me, brother, as you stand in your glory. I know you won't mind if I tell the whole story. Get yourself together. Learn to know your side. Shall we commit our own genocide before you check out your mind? I know we've all got problems. That's why I'm here to say, keep peace with me and I with you. Let me love in my own way.
All right. I've taken up a lot of time, so if people want my commentary on what I think that song means and how it relates to this talk, I'd be happy to answer it in the Q&A. And of course, this is all focused a lot on more on ideology, but I would be happy to suggest some material ways too that our current system of education is linked to U.S. empire. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil. And I apologize for the technical piece. I was following along with the text that you had sent me, and I wasn't aware of the problem we were having. But that was great, and I love the sweep of what you've just done, moving from the ancient Romans and Britons through the Dark Ages to the cataclysms of the Atlantic world and North America to the Black Power era and Curtis Mayfield. It's an amazing sweep. I invite people on using the Q&A function to submit questions, please, but I'll get us started. I have a few questions, but first one, just I want to kind of filling in some of the gaps that you didn't, you gestured towards, but didn't say too much about tonight. I know you've written a lot about the late 19th century boarding schools and on into the 20th century. Could you just talk a little bit more about that chapter of the history of education in the United States?
Yeah, so one of the things that only occurred to me after doing more and more research was that to me, the 19th century was relatively familiar just because as a student of African-American education, like Hampton and Tuskegee loom so large, and they're both 19th century institutions. And it was easy because a lot of other people have made connections to this particularly like Shanina Lomoema or Kim Carey-Warren and other scholars, to link those flows of influence from Hampton into other spheres of empire, whether it's Native American boarding schools. You can think about the fact that the infamous Carlisle Institute got its start first with prisoners of war who were taken to Hampton before they were taken to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And all of those post-Civil War 19th century institutions loom large in our understanding of how education can be used as a weapon against Black people and indigenous sovereignties across the globe. But the reason why I started going back to the 18th century is because these missionaries, Protestant missionaries coming out of Yale, have ideas about how to civilize other people that become localized at first, going off to educate the Mohican people or to the Delawares, or thinking about another Yale graduate in Rhode Island wanting to train to free African slaves and train them to become missionaries to go back to Africa, including Phyllis Wheatley. At any rate, those people become important to the next generation of new American citizens who begin to globalize those localized ideas. And so you have children in Sri Lanka named John Sargent after these Yale missionaries. And in Hawaii, what occurs there becomes the model for Hampton, because Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who founded that institution, was born as a subject of the Hawaiian kingdom to white missionary parents. And so there's actually a much older genealogy that could be told in detail to provide more context to the 19th century. And I think this part is trying to show that there's a relation between an antagonism between civilization and savages that has been forwarded and changed over time through education and schooling, but that has strong continuity as well.
Thanks. You know, I have so many questions, and some of them are pretty granular and some of them are kind of huge philosophical questions, but let me maybe hit both of those registers by twinning a couple of questions. One is, you know, and you gesture to this yourself in giving an account of your own experience as an educator on the Navajo Nation. So I just would like, you know, we're implicated, you and I, as educators. So one of the questions is, you know, how do you see yourself in this history? That's kind of the local granular way of asking the question. The bigger philosophical and kind of sweeping historical question is, to what extent can the university be decolonized? Or to what extent has it been? Can it be? Thinking about the 21st century now with this deep, deep history of education as an imperialist practice. How do you think about education now and what the university is and might be made to be as an institution?
Well, to the first part, you know, I was taught horrible things in my, you know, public school education in Georgia, and I have had to over time unlearn and relearn a lot of stuff. So I went out to the Navajo Nation thinking that I was taking part in a civil rights movement to provide everybody with an excellent education. And when I got there, I started to kind of realize that there's not much difference in what I'm doing than to what those people I thought were bad people at, you know, Carlisle Indian Institute were doing in the 19th century. There was no Navajo language or cultural instruction. I was teaching English only classes and preparing my students really just to be, you know, low wage laborers. Maybe a few of them would go to college, but that's still not so different from the idea of a talented 10th, right? And then as someone who went to Yale and got a PhD and studies the history of education and is now writing about the history of education, is going to publish a book, I'm also part of these knowledge makers who come out of Yale with PhD that I write about in my book. to try to influence policy or shape the way that we think about the world. And it's really a competition over ideas. And that I was able to get this entry point into a conversation over, or a competition over ideals, precisely because I got a degree from a fancy university. And so what I think now is that in my own classes, you know, I'm very sympathetic to Moten and Harney's idea of the undercommons, and trying to think of ways that I can steal from the university while I'm in it. And so until I get some conservative students who record me in the classroom, I think of that space as a place where I have a little bit of power, where I can change some of the dynamics and try to challenge some of the received hierarchies, and create a more, I would say, egalitarian or anarchistic practice in the space of the classroom. But that's just, you know, it's a loophole of retreat, and not something that can be permanently sustained. I think that the university, from its inception and through its present, is a medieval institution that cannot be disconnected from the history of Christianity, or the history of imperialism, or the history of the founding violence that accompanies all of those things, which is why I'm trying to suggest that, you know, this way of schooling becomes a means of violence, a continuation of these founding violences by other means. And as we face a world where we're looking at the potential for environmental collapse on an apocalyptic level globally that resembles some of the environmental changes that affected indigenous populations through colonization, I suspect that the way that the university will be decolonized is the same way that Rome was decolonized, is that it will collapse, and that collapse will allow other means of learning and knowing and surviving to reemerge. That's a bleak vision. You know, I would punt to think about my comrades and colleagues and friends in the Red Nation who have proposed a Red Deal that outlines a way of getting there without societal collapse. But, you know, that's contingent upon the end of capitalism and the return of indigenous land. And, you know, we can't even recognize that there was an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. So I don't know how we're going to get there, but there are people who have ideas about how to do it.
Right. Yeah, far be it from me to defend Yale University, but just a historian's observation that, you know, you can just look at the architecture of the place and understand that the institution was not built to teach what you apparently learned there. So there might be some modicum of hope in that. And it's interesting just to think about Curtis Mayfield for a minute, that the song that you played us is pretty much from the very moment that from the inside of these institutions, fields like Black studies and Native studies and ethnic studies and women's studies were sprouting like mushrooms in the kind of recently democratized institution in the post-war period, right? So I guess one question is, you know, what the advent of all the studies, the advent of the kind of interdisciplinary, more radical disciplines within the university, how important is that to the story of decolonization, I guess, or is it just not important? And I could accept that answer, certainly. But then from there, maybe go ahead and take the move towards Curtis Mayfield. We have a question in the chat about how you want us to think about that song.
Well, to you know, again, just like in the broad outline of Roman and European imperial history that I sketched, there's no institution is total. There's no conquest that is fully complete, and that there are always pockets of and means to resist and continue alternative ways of thinking and being, even if they're constrained and attempted to be constantly subordinated. And so, you know, because of the specifics of US imperialism just like Rome, right? Like Rome succeeded because it became a multicultural empire in which a variety of people could gain citizenship. The United States was conscious of that and has emulated that as its model as a democratic republic. And it's been forced to do so because people have been able to get access to ways of education where they can become legible to people with power, and they can gain access to power, and they can fight. But the terms of the debate are more or less embedded within the extant system of power relations. And so in a sort of, in Stuart Hall's reading of Gramsci, I think of these as moments of crisis and concession that produce new forms of common sense. And so just like I'm joining a group of scholars who challenged ways of writing about or understanding the purpose of schools, I'm able to do that because people came before me and made it possible. And that maybe I'm contributing within the realm of ideas or common sense, other ways of thinking that can create some concessions. But there's not going to be a decolonization of the university until there's a decolonization of the US empire. But there will be room for concessions to favor hegemony and allow us to, teach Black studies.
Yeah. What's your, I don't want to lose the question about Curtis Mayfield, but let's deal with this for a minute. What's your advice to students who, I remember the struggles so vividly when I was younger, just trying to kind of figure out, like, how could scholarship be a vehicle for my passions? How could learning in such a place as a university kind of do the work that I wanted to do with my own education? What's your advice to today's student who is facing more of a crisis or series of crises than maybe you or I were, and who have high hopes for where education might take them, but also have well-earned skepticism about the institutions that are doing the work of education?
The institution's job is to replicate itself. It's a vehicle of social reproduction. But within that, it doesn't mean that there aren't people or practices or ideas that are contained within that institution that don't challenge it or challenge you in ways that can be personally meaningful and socially, I guess, I don't know if progressive is the right word, but W.E. Du Bois talked about the college as the founding stone of education and not the kindergarten. And I think that the great thing about college is that the liberal arts as a millennial old tradition is about having time to think. And there's nothing more precious than having time to think and learn and read. And that is the true value of spending 4 years at an institution. Because within your time to think and read, you can develop ideas that can change you and change the world, for good or ill. And I would suggest that for students who feel marginalized or like they don't have a home here, where the university doesn't love them, that it's unwise to seek recognition from an institution that wasn't built for you. And that it is better to seek recognition and knowledge from yourself and your kindred, who you make, the family that you make and can make at an institution. There are folks, look, I remember one time in the hallway at Yale, in the AFAN building, I was saying goodbye to Glenda Gill, my dissertation advisor, and just like I slipped, I was like, I love you. Like, you're not supposed to say that to teachers, but I did. I had a profound admiration, and love for her. And now when I teach my students on the first day of class, I tell them that I love them. And what I mean by that is that, like, it's a promise from me to them that through the course of talking and learning from each other, I will love them, and that will change me. And it has changed me. Like, I'm a different person, like on a very meaningful level, because I've had the opportunity to learn and teach and read books and have time to think. And so we all have to find a way to sustain ourselves economically. We gotta get a job, we gotta sell our labor. But absent that, there are other ways of finding life within these structures.
Mm-hmm.
That's great and beautiful and more hopeful. Let's pivot back to Curtis Mayfield. Can you talk about how you're seeing that song as an alternative way of knowing, as a resource, I mean, there are many ways that one might enter that conversation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
These days have been dark. A lot of days have been dark. For most of my time as a college professor, there are days when I sit on the floor of my office and cry because of the violence of the world that's around me. And lately I have been listening to a lot of Curtis Mayfield. I really recommend an album that followed this. It's called There's No Place Like America Today, which is slightly less, it's more minimal. And I like that. And he stays right in that pocket. But what Curtis is telling me here is he has created an alternative to the Declaration of Independence. We the people, right? And all those esteemed ideals from the Enlightenment bound up within this classical idea of a democratic republic, combining mixed government from ancient Greece and Rome. And he's shifted that perspective. We the people who are darker than blue. And for me, when I'm thinking about this whole history of English people who do not identify with the people who were harmed by empire, but instead identify with the perpetrators of imperial violence, that's what schooling is trying to teach us. It's trying to think us that we need to be civilized, we need to behave in a certain way, we need to direct our attention toward a certain hierarchy and submit to it as the one and right way. And Curtis is saying, it's like, no, we the people who are darker than blue, we are the ones who recognize the kindred in the folks who have been conquered and enslaved and oppressed. And juxtaposing this with those Picts, to me, the Picts, the Scottish indigenous people of Britain who were painting themselves blue, and the rejection of that by a whole hundreds of year process by the English to make themselves seem civilized in the Roman fashion, that's a contemporary way of philosophy, or creating a philosophy of life that embraces what is supposed to be abhorred in yourself. And I know that there are queer people and non-binary people and poor people and all sorts of folks who feel like they've been taught to abhor parts of themselves. And Curtis is saying that is a pathway to genocide. And say, shall we commit our own genocide before you check our mind? And the pathway for freedom there is through community and through one's own thinking and relationship to kin. So rather than embracing the hierarchies of white supremacy to that high yellow girl or somebody who looks like me, who has Black family and would be aspirational looking up, he's saying, no, you are just the surface of a dark, deep well. And I would say the same thing to the English. The pathway for them to decolonize themselves, and maybe Matt, you might identify with this, given your own research into white ethnicity, is these so-called white people have a lot of unlearning to do about their history. And when Marjorie Taylor Greene and them folks want to talk about Anglo-Saxon civilization, I invite them to read a book. So to me, like, the song that follows this actually on this album is Move On Up. And there's a narrative there for me. So he's embracing a kind of self and communal love of what should be abhorred as a first step to preventing the genocide of a people or a way of life, and then providing another pathway to ascent. And that ascent is not, it's not the aspirational materialist acquisitive pathway. It's a social and spiritual and joyous pathway in which the position of the abhorred is the so-called civilization of violence. We're moving on up out of this place. And that's what that means to me.
Yeah. You've started to answer this by your focus on Mayfield, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about the arts in general as the weapons of the week, the kind of not just an embodiment of the alternative ways of knowing, but an embodiment of the will to know differently, and of resistance of politics by other means. And there's a question here in the Q&A about the art that's on your desktop, and whether you'd say anything about that artist.
You know, I forgot actually the name of the artist, but hold up. I actually recently, if that person wants to email me and my Wesleyan email address, I can pull it up. It's easy enough. And I did see recently that there's a book, I wonder if I saved it, that came out that has that as its cover. Tell them to email me. I'm
okay. I think you just did.
Yeah. The thing about the arts as a practice of thought and questioning and challenging orthodoxy, I think it's very useful. And the thing about history to me is that history is a way of revealing what was known and lost, or at least intuiting or approximating what was known and lost through these violences, and to understanding how it happened. And when I teach classes on the history of education, what I try to teach is the dialectic between the folks like John Sargent and the students that he's teaching, who are acting at different purposes. For the Mohican Nation, and for instance, the Brothertown Indians, they had classical liberal arts scholars who were Native. And it gave them a way to understand the world that the English was trying to shape around them, and to a toolkit with which they could combat it that was not necessarily present or effective absent within their own indigenous knowledges, which is not to delegitimize that, but just to say that there needed to be more adaptation. And that's why they sought out education. And it wasn't a way to replace indigenous ways of knowing, but to enhance it. And when I was trying to suggest that, like, I don't know what I've lost in terms of different ways of loving and knowing and being through my schooling, what I can say is that, like, through my study of history, I've gained, I think, a different way of viewing the world that combines with my own personal experience and the experience of people I love and people I've learned from. And that different way of viewing the world, if given the appropriate audience, which I have as a teacher, it can, on the level of personal experience and through personal experience, collective experience, change the way that we see things that we take for granted. And there's nothing more important than what counts as common sense. And so when I titled this talk Domestic Empire, I said that because a lot of people, even the guy who wrote a book, How to Hide an Empire, one chapter on Native Americans, the rest of it's about the territories. What happens if we take away all the territories, we remove all the military bases? From the perspective of the indigenous population, is the United States still an empire? If we have states in Hawaii and Alaska and all these states that contain within them over 565 tribes? So we can think about imperialism as domestic, as where we live, and something that we are experiencing now in our lives.
Right, ongoing
Yeah.
is the really important piece, because we are taught, in as much as we're taught to think about questions of empire at all, which basically we are not, but in as much as we're taught to think of them as in the past.
Yeah, and that's the thing about it. I didn't want to make this a talk about settler colonialism, which is, through the interventions of indigenous scholars and the white scholar Patrick Wolf, is trying to talk about colonialism as an ongoing structure within specific societies that is fundamentally premised upon the elimination of the native. And, I get that now, having taught on the Navajo Nation and become friends with many indigenous people in ways that I would have never have thought about on my own, or unless there happened to be these scholarly interventions. But I'm thinking of settler colonialism as a specific practice within an imperial force. So what is happening in Puerto Rico or in Guam is not settler colonialism, it's imperial, and that there can be multiple practices within this empire. What I want to think about is, you know, in a lot of the sort of Afro-pessimist readings, the moment of cataclysm and world change is the colonial encounter, 1492. And it produced a modernity that they argue is premised inherently upon anti-Blackness. And I am sympathetic with that. You know, I'm laying in my office crying over dead Black people all the time. But I think that there's a more fundamental antagonism between empire or civilization and the savage other that is operating beneath anti-Blackness and informing it. And that, you know, even though the United States is a global superpower and empire, many of the other European empires collapsed and left in their wake these, you know, sort of fracture of nation states. But they contain within them that same antagonism towards the savage and the other. Mm-hmm. And we've homogenized this nation state form, and often, you know, the mode of social reproduction through schools globally in a way that I don't know, to me needs further inquiry and theorization.
Khalil Johnson, I could talk to you for hours, but it can't be right now. Thank you so much. It's just been, it's been great to talk to you. It's been great to learn from you and to think with you. And I really appreciate your taking the time. And I should say, you know, this event was the first casualty of the pandemic for us. This was an event that was to have taken place almost exactly a year ago, and it got canceled. So it's great to catch up. And thanks for taking the time. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you. And to our audience, thanks for joining us. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you as well. We will be back in the fall with a new calendar of events, either brick and mortar or Zoom, or maybe some of both. But in either case, we're committed to this series on democracy in America, and we will continue to think alongside you as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Matt, for the invitation, and for everyone who participated and listened to me. I appreciate it.
No, thanks so much. It was great. Thank you. We'll talk soon, Khalil.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Have a good night.